2 years ago, during the first semester of studying for my board exams, the state of my mental health was detrimental. I was pulling my hair out of frustration during the daytime and soaking up my pillows with an immeasurable amount of tears during the nighttime. This was my norm, my reality. During this time, a dear friend of mine had unconsciously constructed this idea that I was willingly choosing to become distant from her. And since I rarely responded to her texts or calls, she'd become accustomed to this belief. It was only until later on that I explained to her that the immense stress and vulnerability that I was suffering through was the reason why I felt I could not talk to her and possibly even open up to her, to which she ultimately responded with understanding. Now, let's reflect upon this story. Her perception of the situation was emotional, but the reality was circumstantial. She saw distance, yet I felt despair. She saw avoidance, yet I was simply drowning in silence. Today, I wish to uncover the complexities of the gap between perception and reality, exploring why this gap exists, how our biases lead us to change how we treat others and form opinions, and even how we shape our world and bridge that gap, one moment at a time. Now, there is no doubt that our brains are truly remarkable. However, they are not built to constantly value accuracy. Every second, our senses send millions of signals to our brains. However, we can only consciously process a few dozen. And since humanity's survival has been based on making decisions quickly, our brains have developed mechanisms, or mental shortcuts you could say, that help us fill in missing details and filter out information that we feel is important. Psychologists refer to these mental shortcuts as cognitive biases. And although they make the process of creating judgments much easier, they often distort our perception of reality. A common cognitive bias is the confirmation bias, which is our tendency to favor information that supports our existing judgments. For example, a manager may only value information that supports his initial negative impression of an employee's character. So, this would encourage the manager to conduct flawed evaluations that would slim the employee's chances of ever receiving a promotion. Another example is the misinformation effect, which involves a person's original memory of a situation being altered by misleading post-event information or questions, which can lead to impaired recollections of events. An example could be hearing a slightly wrong version of a lyric or quote, and subsequently, that altered version is the one that remains in our memory. For instance, the famous movie line, "Luke, I am your father," was never actually said in Star Wars. Can you believe that? It was actually, "No, I am your father." Our perception is not a mirror. It's a painting, and each stroke is colored by memory, mood, and belief. Hence why the gap between perception and reality doesn't signify a weakness in human intelligence, no, but only reinforces that we are simply human. This innate gap we humans possess doesn't just remain within the recesses of our mind, it bleeds into our relationships as well. Reflecting back on my experience that I previously mentioned, that unconscious bias that my friend withheld could have possibly placed our friendship upon a fragile pedestal. I mean, just think about it. If she avoided confronting me about the situation and asking me for the truth of the matter, we would have naturally drifted apart, and she would have proceeded to carry on with her ideas that I was arrogant and careless about our friendship. And acknowledging the potential impact that her bias could have formed, just simply breaks my heart. When our perceptions drift away from reality, connections between individuals immensely weaken. It is also worth mentioning that humanity's tendency to label others and interpret their behavior without even knowing them can ultimately shape workplaces, schools, and societies as a whole. An example could be taken through how recently researchers at the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of Chicago had taken initiative to examine this situation firsthand, filing 83,000 fake job applications using white and black names for 11,000 entry-level positions at a variety of Fortune 500 companies. Their working paper, titled a discrimination report card, had demonstrated that an employer would call back the presumably white applicants about 9% more than black ones. And that number rose to roughly 24% for the worst offenders. So it comes to no surprise when job candidates are eager to change their names on their applications. In fact, the 2023 edition of Greenhouse's Candidate Interview Experience Report had surveyed 1,200 US-based job candidates, almost one-fifth of whom had admitted to avoiding the discriminatory hiring practices through changing their names on their applications. Of those who adopted this change, 45% did so to sound less ethnic, 42% to sound younger, and 22% to sound like the opposite gender. If we have to resort to changing our given special names, the source of our singular identities, just to avoid constructed and prejudiced lenses of judgment and possibly stand a chance at safeguarding our careers and our futures, we have failed as a society. Flawed perceptions of people's supposed characters or their situations can ultimately change the course of multiple lives, putting the future of our societies at stake. However, such destructive outcomes can be combated. They can be combated through awareness. Now, many of you may feel discouraged following my previous points, but it should be instilled among your minds that the gap between our biased judgments and the truth is bridgeable. Now, if that is the case, then first, pause before judging. Suppose you're meeting someone for the first time, and you suddenly feel that instantaneous judgment arise from your perception of that individual. You must pause and ask yourself, is what I'm believing really true? Or what else could be true about this person? These two questions put a halt on our bias, preventing it from influencing our behavior and ultimately our treatment of that towards that individual. Second, challenge your opinion. Most of the time, our first thought is not always our best thought. So if you assume, hey, I already know this person, you should just remind yourself that majority of the time, maybe you don't. However, this can lead us to act upon our curiosities and spark up authentic conversations between individuals, allowing each person to form an opinion of one another based on their genuine characters. This paves the way for a strong connection to be formed between them. Third, expand your circle. Seek out a wide array of opinions from people who view the world differently. Remember, perception is ambiguous, and our brains can interpret the same information in various ways. So when we make an effort to truly listen, not to respond, but to simply understand, we manage to close that gap. And last but not least, practice active empathy. Many people tend to not understand the true meaning of empathy, simply passing it off as feeling sorry for someone or their situation. But I want to remind you all that it's not just that. Empathy is our effort to place ourselves in their shoes and our ability to picture their world as if it's ours. To practice active empathy, we must constantly ask ourselves, what might it feel like to be them currently? Implementing empathy into our daily interactions can form a bridge across every perception gap we withhold. Now, no one is excluded from this phenomenon. We all carry the burden of living our lives with a gap between perception and reality, a gap established by our own preconceived biases, our own assumptions, and our own limited viewpoints. However, awareness surrounding this issue can become our bridge. When we pause, challenge our convictions, and employ empathy, the veil of our biases can be pushed away from our eyes, allowing us to clearly see others for who they truly are. We start to see the world for what it actually is and not what our restricted mindsets imagine it to be. I want you guys to take a look at this image right here. Look at it clearly. Do you see a duck or do you see a rabbit? Now, for whoever sees a duck, may I see a show of hands? And what about everyone else? Whoever sees a rabbit, may I see a show of hands? Now, whether you see a duck or a rabbit will always change. However, this image right here will never change. This simple drawing will always remain the same. However, our perception of it will always differ. The same is true in life. When we change the way we see, the world itself starts to change. Therefore, mind the gap, because beyond our perceptions not only lies reality, but the empathy and clarity our world needs most. Thank you.